Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan. MSP. This is Ukraine War news update, part 2 of my news update for the 11th of August 2023. And I'll be going straight to the frontline update. I've already done a full frontline update for today, randomly done one first thing. So we have some mixed news up in the Kupiansk area, from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea in this northeastern sector. The Ukrainians have actually pushed the Russians back to the west of Liman Pershi. Some unexpected advances for the Ukrainians there. They're finding it very difficult in this area. There are some gains for the Russians slightly further down. There have been gains to the south of Vilshana and Persho-Travnevi, and around Kislivka and Kotlyarivka, there are some gains. In the Guardian, there's a report about what Hanamalia is saying. Ukraine forces have retaken land near Bakhmut from Russia, Hughes says. But actually, let's go and look at what is said about what's going on further north. Russia's here. So residents are told to evacuate Kharkiv, about 56 miles west, where they would have the option to move to safer regions with children, elderly people, and those who are sick in particular urged to leave. So these are to Kharkiv. These are from places in the Kupiansk district, where it's looking pretty difficult. Given the difficult security situation and the increasing amount of shelling by Russian terrorist forces in the Kupiansk community, you have the opportunity to evacuate to a safer place. Malia said the main focus of the Ukrainian, Russia's defense ministry announced its soldiers had improved their position in the area. Malia said the main focus of the Ukrainian army is the south, and the Russians are focused in the east. The Russians are infiltrating in two main areas, Kupiansk and Liman. It's a nightmare there. So that's quite an admission that actually Kupiansk and Liman are not looking good for the Ukrainians. That is this area up here in the Kupiansk, or maybe that larger sort of sector, and then down here towards Liman, Serebyansky Forest, and somewhat north of there. In the direction of Bakhmut in the north, the Russians are attacking. We're attacking on the southern flank of Bakhmut. She added, why are the Russians doing this? We are making good progress on both flanks in Bakhmut. We have taken almost all the key heights there. The Russians were trapped there. They couldn't get out, and now they can't move around the city of Bakhmut because the Ukrainians are shelling the city from the heights. And in order to pull our forces away from Bakhmut, the Russians moved forward in the other direction so that we would throw our forces to save them, and they exposed their rear near Bakhmut. That's why they launched an offensive in other places to stop our attack on Bakhmut. And so on and so forth. It goes on to talk about further south there. But the idea, like I've said many times, is this is an attempt to distract the Ukrainians in their attacks, both on the southern front, but also, their successful counterattacks in the Bakhmut area. Now, just a really quick recap of what's going on elsewhere. On my map, there have been some mapping changes. Andrew Perpetua, the pro-Ukrainian mapper, who's very objective, has shown some Russian advances or gains around the Verkhnokha-Miyanka area in the Seversk front line here. That is just north of Bakhmut, and that's somewhere we haven't seen a lot of activity for a long time. I don't know whether that's rejigging or whether the Ukrainians have been pushed back in the area. There's also Suryat maps showing some Russian gains in the Rozdilivka area. I think that's following along from some other claims in the area recently. So the Ukrainians possibly being pushed back there, and the Russians have made some gains in the Bakivka area just to the north of Bakhmut. So there's been some sort of to and froing here. It's a bit of a yo-yo place, but it looks like the Russians have got a little bit of momentum there. The Ukrainians have been trying their luck further to the south around Yahidne and this Rose Alley area more recently, as Bakivka has become quite difficult. But at the same time, there's some gains to the north of Klishivka, according to Suryat Maps pro-Russian mapper, but I think they're just catching up with that. I think those gains were made 4 or 5 days ago. And I don't know that there's too much territorial change in the southern Bakhmut area from Klishivka through Andriivka to Kurdyivka. Remember, we saw that the Russians supposedly made some huge gains northwest, sorry, of Kurdyivka. Haven't heard anything about that from any other sources. So yeah, I would say the summation of everywhere along this sort of northeast and eastern front is that the Russians are really trying hard to push back. The Ukrainians are having mixed success around Bakhmut, according to some sources, although I haven't seen the Ukrainian general staff admit that they're sort of being pressured by the Russians in any of those places, but the Russians are certainly making some claims about that. Deep State map, pro-Ukrainian mapper has indicated some slight gains for the Ukrainians north of Avdiivka in Krasnohorivka. Not much, just a little change of the map there. But a lot of activity on the southern front line, and this is where Ukraine suddenly seem to have been making some gains over the last few days that are slightly more accelerated compared to what we've seen over the last few weeks or so. So Uruzhany seems to be very much under the cosh. The Ukrainians are pressuring this village, which is to the east of Staromyrsky. They took Staromyrsky, and they've been attacking Uruzhany from three sides. And there's geolocated evidence to suggest they're in the center, and they are making some good progress there. So I'd expect Uruzhany to be liberated fairly soon. Andrew Perpetua is talking about the importance of Kaminchik here and getting down to this kind of level. And once you're past there, then there's once you're past some of these initial large defenses, it's possibly straight down to Mariupol type thing. So this could be a really important next week, really, to see what happens after the Ukrainians liberate this kind of area. How quickly dominoes might fall, or whether it's going to be the same sort of situation for Zavitne, for Staromyivka, and then, of course, we get to that big trench line. How much do the Russians have in their locker to help their defensive operations there? And actually, around Rubitne, further to the west, south of Orikhiv, the Ukrainians are now in Rubitne. There we have them by the sign of that, and actually walking. So Ukrainian soldiers calmly pass a destroyed BMP-3, which was reportedly struck by first-person view drone near Rubitne. Some more destroyed and abandoned equipment can be seen further up on the road. So quite a lot of equipment lost around here for the Russians. We have had large Russian equipment losses, lost over the last sort of few days on the Ukrainian general staff figures, and this could be as a result of activity like this in this area of Rubitne. So if we go back to here, my map, you can see that Andrew Perpetua has some fairly significant gains for the Ukrainians around Rubitne. Indeed, they are fighting inside. Well, these are the Russian defensive lines, but the Russians have been pushed back to only robustly defending sort of the southern half of Rubitne. And in the fields around the west and the east, they are being pushed back as well. So this is, finally some decent success, some fruits for the Ukrainian labours. They've lost a lot of equipment and troops in this Rubitne area, as the Russians have 3 or 4 lines of defence there. I mean, if you look at the southern front here on the war mapper map, which gives you an indication of the number of defensive lines, you can just see how densely fortified the Rubitne area is, and that route down to Tokmak, to the point where people like Andrew Perpetua have been saying, well, surely this Velika Novosilka route is far, far more preferential. As yes, you eventually get down to some defenses here, but once you're through them, it's right down to Mariupol pretty much, and it's a very different kettle of fish when you look south of Orikhiv, where you just got lines and lines of defenses, and then you've got Tokmak itself, and then you go to the west of there, so coming down from Kamyanska through Vasilivka, you still got a number of defenses. The Russians knew that they needed to defend Tokmak and Melitopol, and so that's why they've got these huge numbers of trenches and fortifications there. Uh, the question is, do they have the troops to defend them? As I keep asking. So anyway, that's Robotna. Not hearing anything further to the west. It's more positional fighting around Piatikaki and Kamyanska, and not really heard anything about the situation on the Dnipro River around Kazachi Lahiri and Antonivsky Bridge, and perhaps even Holopristan as well. So that's a frontline situation. Robotna is going to be featuring a lot today. As Osint Yuri says, it looks like the Russians are getting screwed over near Robotny. So that is there, and Uruzhany could be two areas of success for the Ukrainians. Okay, now moving on to military aid. Biden on Thursday asked Congress to approve $20.6 billion in additional funding for Ukraine, including $13 billion in new military aid and $8.5 in additional economic, humanitarian, and security assistance for Ukraine and other countries. The German government wants to announce the delivery of Taurus cruise missiles to Ukraine in the near future. The Chancellery is currently working on a solution with the US that could lead to a double delivery of Taurus cruise missiles and ATACMS. Okay, so something to mention here. It seems to me like the Germans could be, and I did mention this previously, doing what they did with the Leopards, which is, yeah, we'll release the Leopards if you guys promise some Abrams main battle tanks, and that forced America's hands. Well, here we have the Germans possibly saying, yeah, we'll give Taurus these long range cruise missiles that are very similar to the Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles the Ukrainians already have. We'll give them if the Americans give ATACMS. And that could be forcing the Americans' hands. And I said the other day, this could be a fairly smart move from the Germans, as it was with the Leopards. The Ukrainians are going to receive a bunch of 30 odd, 31, I think it is, Abrams main battle tanks in September. So they're going to be coming pretty soon. And they wouldn't be getting them if it wasn't for the Germans. You might say obstinacy, but it could be pretty good diplomacy from the Germans here. So we might see some ATACMS along with these Taurus. Germany is working with MBDA, so that's the company that manufactures Taurus, the same company that makes the Storm Shadow and Scalp. They're pretty much the same missiles. Long-range cruise missiles, similar. To potentially give the Taurus missiles a software update, preventing them from striking Russian territory when they will be firing to Ukraine, or when they'll be firing from Ukraine. The reports Der Spiegel. So that could be the same similar sort of thing that we've seen from other weapons, provided that they are geofenced so that they can't strike into Russia. Whether Ukrainians can then tamper with that, or whether they say, "Yep, fair enough, we won't do that," because if we do that, we won't get these weapons. So, UK Ministry of Defence have released a sort of video that shows that 9 nations are coming together to train Ukrainian recruits on a UK-led training program. So the UK has actually trained up a huge number of Ukrainian troops, but they've done it with the assistance of many others. It's just that it happens in UK. So UK, Sweden, Canada, Netherlands, Denmark, New Zealand, Lithuania, Australia, Norway, and Finland are all involved in training the Ukrainian soldiers in the UK, and that's been, I think, really, really useful, as those counteroffensive battalions waiting to throw themselves into the actual counteroffensive. They still haven't, but they have had training, and they're continuing to get training. And there are some talks about some of these troops that are not being battle hardened being sent to the front line for a bit, rotated in to maybe the Velika Novosilka salient, maybe the Robotna area, being rotated in there to get some combat experience, and then rotated out. That kind of thing going on. I can't confirm that. Pentagon, US to further increase 155mm ammunition production. US plans to increase the production of 155mm shells, bringing it to 80,000 per month next year. The country currently manufactures around 24,000 rounds a month, And I mentioned the other day it was upping to about 28,000. I don't know if it no, it doesn't mention that here. His statement comes amid Ukraine's growing need for NATO standard ammunition, which is used with Western provided artillery. According to Ryder, the US has provided Ukraine with over 2 million 155mm ammunition rounds since the start of Russia's full scale invasion. Uh, so that's all good news. The ramping up of production by allied nations for ammunition is being largely successful given where they were at. These things take time, but they are getting there, and it's going to be hugely important for Ukraine's continued success, for allowing them to continue with momentum in their counteroffensive. If they run out of shells, they're obviously in trouble, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen now. Right. Azerbaijan is announcing that it is donating mine clearance vehicles to Ukraine. That's pretty huge and an interesting thing for them to do, given their proximity to Russia and being members of the CTSO, the kind of like NATO equivalents that Russia are heading. It's just, yeah, good stuff. Thanks, Azerbaijan. Netherlands handed over 6 mobile medical support complexes to Ukrainian border guards. With the help of such a complex, medics can deploy a full-fledged hospital in a field with its own operating room, pre-operative room, IC ward, laboratory, and sterilization room. So excellent stuff. Thank you very much, the Netherlands. Right, moving on to geopolitical topics. Here we have, as I'm going to concentrate a little bit on Duda, the leader of Poland, in charge of the right-wing government there. Today, Ukraine has a much more modern military potential than Russia. It's a matter of numbers. They're not able to launch a decisive counterattack at the moment. They need more help, said the Polish President Duda. Helping Ukraine is not charity. Poles have many reasons to supply weapons to Ukraine. That's an important statement. It's like, yeah, you might think we're being nice, but actually, this is in our own kind of self-interest. Poland need to do this, as do other Eastern European nations, as do all the allied nations. It's in the best interest to support Ukraine. It's not just from a moral positioning, of course that's important too, but it's from a pragmatic geopolitical stance as well. Russia will not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I believe that the nuclear arsenal in the Russian Federation is under the collective control of many people. It does not depend on a single decision of Putin. I'm much more concerned about the possible problems with the nuclear power plant. In my opinion, the threat of an explosion at Ukrainian nuclear power plant is much more serious than in the case of using nuclear weapons. So that's Duda. In fact, there's an opinion piece in the Washington Post that includes excerpts from an interview with him, Mark A. Tyson here, that I think is quite revealing. It's very simple, says Polish President Duda, Andrzej Duda. He told me last week, right now, Russian imperialism can be stopped cheaply because American soldiers are not dying. But if we don't put a halt to Russian aggression now, there will be a very high price to be paid. And this is, again, the claim that actually this is a really relatively cheap way. I mean, everyone's going, oh my goodness, how much money is being spent supporting Ukraine? But in terms of what it's achieving, it's doing it far more cheaply than NATO being at war with Ukraine. There are no losses of human life from allied nations. The Ukraine are doing the fighting. There is no cheaper, better way to degrade Russian political and military power than what is taking place in Ukraine. Now, Duda says, we are witnessing a resurgence of Russian imperialism, starting with Moscow's 2008 invasion of Georgia, 2014 attack on Ukraine, and full-scale invasion last year, and its repeated threats directed at the Baltic states, Poland, and all of Central Europe. Vladimir Putin and his cronies are dreaming of power in the Tsars and the restoration of Tsarist territory. We must stop Russia's advance in Ukraine now so that it does not come to pass, as it did in World War I and World War II, that American soldiers have to shed their blood and to lose their lives in Europe to restore peace and liberty to the world. So he's obviously adopting this position where it's like, look, if you don't want American lives to die, I don't think it'll ever come to that, but if you don't want it to happen, then supporting Ukraine militarily is the way to do it. When I pointed out that about 1/3 of House Republicans recently voted to cut off aid to Ukraine, Duda showed no concern. This is because you have a democracy and you are free not to be like-minded, he told me with a smile. Indeed, Duda is facing an anti-Ukraine revolt of his own. The far-right Confederation Coalition, which has promised to stop the Ukrainization of Poland, is at 13% in the polls, making it the third most popular in Poland. If neither Duda's Law and Justice Party nor the centrist opposition secures an outright majority in October's parliamentary elections, Confederation could become kingmaker in the new parliament. I've talked to you before about the democratic backsliding in Poland. It's quite a right-wing government there. That's if the Ukrainian war wasn't happening and the Polish government weren't so supportive of Ukraine and getting a lot of praise for that, they'd be getting an awful lot of criticism for some of the things they're doing with their democratic institutions in Poland. And I'm halfway through going through an article with you about that. In other words, the article continues, Duda's bold support for Ukraine is politically courageous. Unfortunately, in the United States, most of the leading Republican presidential candidates are not showing similar courage. Chris Christie, interestingly, has been, I think, quite pro-Ukraine recently, so that's good. Is Duda worried about what will happen to American support for Ukraine if Republicans win in 2024? No, he said. I have no doubt that the United States understands perfectly the threat posed by Russian imperialism, and it is my profound belief that the United States also understands how important it is to make sure that democracy does not disappear from Central Europe. Everyone knows where Russia is. There is no democracy. Um, yes, absolutely. Although, I wish that Duda's own Law and Justice Party would you know adhere to that kind of ideal understanding of democracy in Central Europe. He continues, we have different historical experience. This is like the issue with Orban and Hungary. We have a different historical experience, he said, in Poland. In many countries in Southern Europe, Russia brings a very positive historical associations because she liberated them from occupation by the Ottoman Empire. In Poland, Russia was an occupying force, never a country that brought us liberty. Moreover, he said, while Poland prepared for this moment by diversifying its energy supplies, Hungary is to a very large extent energy dependent on Russia. The only nuclear power plant that they have was built back under communist times. All the gas supplies come from Russia. Some would say this is a political mistake, and I agree. With military support, humanitarian relief, and taking in refugees, no nation has done more for Ukraine than Poland. Just our military assistance to Ukraine alone, we have sent more than $2 billion. He said Poland has given Ukraine almost our entire fleet of MiG-29s. We have given Ukraine more than 300 tanks as well, including the most modern state-of-the-art German Leopards. This assistance benefits not just Ukraine, but the US as well. For example, Poland recently sent Ukraine's Soviet-designed Mi-24 attack helicopters and is buying the US-made Black Hawks and Apaches to replace them, creating US jobs. Poland has also accepted more Ukrainian refugees than any other country. An estimated 77% of Poles have been involved in helping these refugees in some way, including donating more than $2 billion out of their own pockets. So when we talk about military aid and financial aid, you must remember that countries in Europe will have levels of aid that outstrip kind of American levels of aid in certain domains. How many Americans are housing Ukrainian refugees? Well, hardly any compared to what Poland are doing, right? It's 77% of the country have been involved in helping refugees in some way. Is phenomenal, donating $2 billion out of their own pockets. And that is what other countries just haven't done because they're not in a position to do that, geographically speaking. It's just we can't forget that. Though the vast majority of Poles still welcome Ukrainians, there is definitely a problem of war fatigue, Duda said. There are families in Poland who have had Ukrainian families living in their homes, sharing their same space for a year and a half now. And he noted that Poland's history with Ukraine includes some very difficult moments, such as a massacre of as many as 100,000 Poles by Ukrainian nationalists toward the end of World War II. So there is some interesting history between these two nations, of course. Despite these challenges, Poles are helping Ukrainians because they understand the Russian threat, Duda said. We know that when the Russians come, they rape women, they kill people, they deport people to the east. We know that the Russians must be stopped. Ukraine's admission into NATO, I'm among those who hoped, says Duda, Ukraine would be given more than they actually got at last month's NATO summit in Vilnius in Lithuania. And he goes on to say it isn't a matter of whether Putin or other Russian leaders will stop wanting to rule Ukraine one day. They may want to rule the whole world, Duda said. The question is, will we let them? I think we mustn't allow them. We must not tolerate the changing of borders in Europe by force. He is right. So this is Tyson going on to say, he is right. It would be nice to hear the leading Republican presidential contenders speak with similar moral clarity, and for President Biden to finally back concrete efforts to bring Ukraine into NATO. So the understanding that Biden or the Americans might have been putting a bit of a stop on further uh, concrete assurances to Ukraine at Vilnius. Right, moving on to another subject. I thought that was a good uh, article to get into a bit more of an in-depth analysis of what Duda thinks, what Poland thinks, or at least in the political echelons. Fire erupts at an oil refinery in Belarus after Ukraine warns about Russia's provocation plans. Fire broke out at a gasoline production unit of the Mozyr oil refinery in southeastern Belarus, the country's emergency ministry reported. First responders put out the fire and the incident is being investigated, the ministry wrote. No casualties were reported. Earlier, Ukraine's security services said that it had gathered intelligence indicating that Russia was preparing a large-scale false flag operation at the refinery to drag Belarus into the war against Ukraine. Well, that could go either way. They could either say that and then do it themselves, or that could be the case. Um, both are plausible. Okay, the US overestimates the threat of a military conflict with Russia. Putin is barely surviving, fighting only with Ukraine. Washington should give Kyiv more powerful weapons if it wants the war to end as soon as possible, said the former US ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. Uh, he said that providing Ukraine with long-range ATACMS and F-16 fighter jets is a necessary condition for the armed forces to succeed on the battlefield. The ex-diplomat also shared his vision of what will be considered the end of the war in Ukraine for Biden's administration. So McFaul is actually a really strong supporter of Ukraine and someone that is worth listening to, I think. Russian ruble is falling. So here, Robin Brooks, who's I think an economist, chief economist at the IIF, former chief FX strategist, Goldman Sachs, and senior economist at IMF News. Right, Russian ruble is falling. That's a black line. While the global Brent oil price, blue, is rising. So the price of oil that's not the Urals, that's the kind of non Russian oil price is rising. This kind of decoupling is highly unusual and is the best piece of evidence that the G7 oil price cap is working. Putin isn't getting a windfall from rising oil prices like he did in 2022. And then there are further sort of bits of analysis. So the Russian central bank so the ruble is tanking at the moment. I think it's at 98 against the US dollar. And I think there was some video of the Russian finance minister sort of laughing. It's all quite controversial today or something. Anyway, the Russian central bank, knowing that Russia is on the edge of being ravaged by worsening inflation, is attempting to curb price increases caused by the ruble depreciating so quickly by raising interest rates 40% from 7.5% to 10% within just 2 months. This is one of the few things Russia can do to slow inflation. However, it's also cut into business lending and slow economic growth. Higher cost of business lending inevitably translates into layoffs and unemployment. Tax base in a country hemorrhaging money will shrink due to less economic activity, and the situation in Russia is becoming ever more destabilized, and it appears it is about to get worse. So this is not looking good for Russia, economically speaking. I think that much is clear. Something to definitely keep an eye on. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all your supports. Take care, and I'll speak to you later, maybe, or tomorrow.